The chamber went silent the moment the final vote came in, and I felt every eye in that vast hall turn toward me. Red lights blinked across the floating tally screen, one after another, empire after empire, all choosing the same answer. Destroy them. Destroy the humans before they grow too strong to stop. I sat frozen in my seat, my claws pressed against the cold armrest, because I was the only one who had not raised my hand in agreement. Out of over 300 delegates representing every major power in known space, I was the single voice standing against total annihilation. My name is Vael Thren, and at the time of that vote, I served as a counselor for what remained of my people, the Cathari remnant. We were not a proud empire anymore. We had lost wars, lost worlds, lost the respect of nearly everyone in that room. So when I refused to raise my hand, the silence that followed was not confusion. It was contempt. I could hear it in the way the Draveth delegate exhaled through his breathing slits, a long hiss of disbelief. I could see it in the way the Orengi ambassador tilted her head, as if trying to understand what kind of creature would defy the will of the entire galaxy for the sake of a species barely a century old in space travel. The Grand Speaker, an ancient Voss elder with skin like cracked stone, turned his massive head toward me and asked the question everyone wanted answered. Why would the Cathari remnant of all empires choose to stand alone against a resolution meant to protect every civilized world from a threat none of us fully understood yet? I stood up slowly. My legs felt heavier than they had in years, but my voice did not shake. I told them the truth. I told them that I had seen humans before this council ever heard their name mentioned in a threat assessment. I told them that years before any of this began, I had been a prisoner of war, drifting in the wreckage of my own ship, abandoned by my own commanders, left to die in the cold silence between stars, and it was a human vessel that found me. The Grand Speaker asked why that mattered. Why would one act of mercy outweigh the danger an entire species posed to galactic stability? I answered that it mattered, because mercy was not something any of the empires in that room understood anymore. We had all become so consumed by fear of losing power that we forgot what it meant to make a choice when no one was watching. Humans made that choice, and I believed, with everything I had left, that a species capable of that kind of restraint was not the nightmare the Council imagined. I believed the true nightmare was what would happen if we attacked them anyway. Nobody in that chamber wanted to hear it. Fear does not listen to reason, especially not fear that has already convinced itself it is right. The Draveth delegate stood and reminded everyone that humans had defeated 3 separate incursions in the past 2 years alone, each time against forces that should have overwhelmed them. He said their growth rate was unnatural, their adaptability unmatched, and their willingness to fight without hesitation made them a variable no empire could safely ignore. He said the longer we waited, the more powerful they would become, and one day it would not be a vote, it would be a surrender. I understood his fear. I even understood why every other delegate agreed with him. But understanding fear does not make it wisdom. The vote had already passed by the time I finished speaking. My objection was recorded, filed, and dismissed within minutes. The council moved directly into logistics, deciding which fleets would be pulled from border patrols, which empires would contribute warships, and how the attack would be coordinated to strike every major human colony at once, ensuring no warning could reach their capital in time to organize a proper defense. I sat there listening to admirals from 6 different empires calmly discuss troop numbers and strike formations as if they were planning a routine training exercise instead of the potential extinction of an entire species. Nobody in that room had ever met a human. Nobody had ever sat across from one, spoken with one, watched one make a decision that cost them everything and ask for nothing in return. I had, and that difference, more than any tactical disagreement, was why I could not lift my hand alongside theirs. When the session ended, I walked out of the chamber alone. My aide, a young Cathari officer named Resen, caught up to me in the corridor outside, his eyes wide with something between confusion and fear. He asked me directly if I understood what I had just done. He said that refusing to vote with the council was more than a diplomatic embarrassment. It was a declaration. Every empire in that chamber would now question where the Cathari remnant's loyalty truly stood, and we had already lost enough standing to survive another accusation of betrayal. I told him I understood exactly what I had done, and that I would do it again without hesitation. He asked why. He asked what made me so certain that one species, no matter how disciplined, could stand against the combined might of every other power in the galaxy. I did not answer him with certainty, because I had none to give. What I gave him instead was memory. I told him to walk with me, and as we moved through the long corridor of the council station, I began to explain what happened to me decades earlier, long before any of this reached a vote, long before humans were seen as anything more than a curious new signal picked up at the edge of charted space. It started with silence. My ship had been crippled in an ambush during one of the countless border skirmishes that defined the last years of the Kthari remnant's decline. My crew was gone. My engines were dead. I drifted for what felt like an eternity, watching the stars outside my viewport with the strange calm that comes only when a person has fully accepted that death is close and there is nothing left to do but wait for it. I told Racine that I remembered the exact moment my sensors detected an approaching vessel, and how my first reaction was not hope, but exhaustion. I assumed it was a scavenger ship, come to strip my dead hull for parts before I had even finished dying inside it. I remember closing my eyes and waiting for the tremor of docking clamps, the sound of my hull being torn open for salvage. Instead, I heard something I did not expect. A voice, calm and steady, speaking through an emergency channel in a language my translator struggled to process at first. It was human, and it was asking if anyone aboard my ship was still alive. I did not answer at first, because I could not believe the question was sincere. In my experience, distress calls answered by strangers usually ended one of two ways. Either the strangers ignored you entirely, or they finished what your enemies started. I had never heard of anyone responding to a wrecked enemy vessel by asking if its crew needed rescue. When I finally answered, my voice barely working through the damage to my communication systems, the human on the other end did not ask what empire I served. He did not ask if I was a threat, or demand my surrender, or threaten retaliation if I resisted. He asked if I needed medical assistance and how many others were aboard with me. I told Resin that when they brought me onto their ship, I expected to be placed in restraints, interrogated, perhaps used as leverage against my own government. Instead, I was given medical care by a woman named Grace Coleman, who spoke to me the entire time in a tone so ordinary, so unaffected by the fact that I was clearly not human, that I found myself struggling to process what was happening. She treated my wounds the same way she would have treated one of her own crew. She did not flinch at the shape of my hands, or the color of my blood, or the way my breathing patterns differed from hers. She simply worked, calm and focused, as if saving a stranger from a dying enemy fleet was an unremarkable part of her day. I asked her at one point, once I regained enough strength to speak clearly, why she was helping me. I told her that under the customs of my own people, and under the customs of nearly every other empire I had encountered, a wounded enemy left adrift was considered a resolved conflict, not an obligation. Nobody expected rescue. Nobody offered it. She told me that where she came from, leaving someone to die when you had the ability to help them was not a decision anyone had to think twice about. She said it so plainly, as if the idea of doing otherwise had never even occurred to her as an option worth considering. I remember that conversation more clearly than I remember most of my own life before that day. It reshaped something in me. For the first time, I began to question everything I had been taught about strength, about survival, about what it truly meant to hold power over another living being. Resin asked me, as we reached the end of the corridor, if that single encounter was truly enough to justify standing against the will of the entire council. I told him it was not the only encounter. I told him that in the years that followed my rescue, I stayed in contact with the crew who saved me, watching from a distance as humanity expanded further into known space, forming alliances, defending colonies, and facing threats that should have destroyed a civilization so young. I watched them fight wars they did not start and win battles they were never expected to survive, and every time, the reports that reached me described the same strange pattern: ruthless efficiency in battle, followed by restraint the moment resistance ended. Humans fought without mercy against those who threatened them, but the instant a threat was neutralized, they extended a hand instead of a blade. That contradiction terrified the Council more than any weapon humanity possessed. A predictable enemy is manageable. An enemy who fights without hesitation, but chooses compassion when given the option, is something the other empires had no framework to understand. And what people fear most is what they cannot categorize. I told Racine that the attack the Council had just approved was not simply a strategic decision. It was a reaction born from that fear, an attempt to eliminate a variable too complex to control before it grew large enough to threaten every established power structure in the galaxy. And I believed, standing in that corridor with the weight of my own people's judgment pressing against me, that this fear was about to lead every empire involved into a mistake so severe it would reshape the balance of the galaxy forever. Racine asked what I intended to do now that the vote had passed and there was no path left to stop it through diplomacy. I told him the truth. I intended to warn them, not the Council, not my own government, but the humans themselves. I intended to reach out through the only channel I still had access to, a private line connected to the very crew who had saved my life decades earlier, and give them whatever time I could to prepare for what was coming. He reminded me that doing so would be considered an act of treason against every empire involved in the coalition, including my own. I told him I understood the risk completely, and that I had already accepted it the moment I refused to raise my hand in that chamber. Some choices, once made, cannot be walked back, and I had made mine the instant I decided that loyalty to fear was not the same as loyalty to my people. As I left the Council station that night, boarding a small transport bound for the outer relay stations, where my private communication line was still active, I could not shake the feeling that I was standing at the edge of something far larger than a single battle. Every empire in that chamber believed they were preventing a catastrophe. I believed they were about to cause one, and somewhere beyond the reach of that Council's authority, on a world I had never visited, but had come to understand more deeply than my own, a species built from stubborn resolve and quiet compassion was about to discover that the entire galaxy had turned against them at once. I did not know, as my transport slipped into the dark, whether my warning would arrive in time. I did not know whether the humans I once trusted with my recovery would even believe a Cathari officer reaching out after decades of silence. All I knew was that I could not sit still while an entire species was erased for the crime of being misunderstood. The stars outside my viewport looked the same as they had the night my ship drifted dead in the void, waiting for rescue that should never have come. This time, I was the one reaching out into the dark, hoping someone on the other end would still answer. The transmission took 11 days to reach its destination, bouncing across 3 relay stations I was not authorized to use, each hop risking discovery by Council security forces, who would have arrested me on sight if they intercepted the signal. I spent those 11 days aboard a rented transport, drifting near an abandoned mining outpost, watching my communication console for any sign of a reply, eating almost nothing, sleeping even less. When the response finally came through, it was not from Grace Coleman, the woman who had saved my life all those years ago. It was from a man named Daniel Ashworth, a fleet commander I had never spoken to directly, though I recognized his name from years of following human military reports. His voice on the recording was measured, careful, the voice of someone who had learned to control every reaction before it reached his face. He asked me to confirm my identity and to explain, in detail, why a Kthari Council delegate was using a private channel to contact a human officer instead of going through official diplomatic routes. I told him the truth without hesitation, because there was no time left for careful phrasing. I told him that the Galactic Council had unanimously approved a coordinated strike against every major human colony, timed to hit simultaneously, designed specifically to prevent any warning from reaching their capital before the attack began. I told him fleets from at least a dozen empires were already moving into position, and that the vote had passed with only one dissent, mine. There was a long pause after I finished speaking. I did not know if the silence meant he was consulting with others, or simply trying to determine whether my warning was genuine, or an elaborate trap designed to lure their forces into a vulnerable position. When he finally responded, his question was not what I expected. He did not ask for proof. He did not ask why I was betraying my own government to deliver this warning. He asked how much time they had before the first ships arrived. I told him my best estimate, based on fleet movement patterns I had observed before leaving the Council station, was somewhere between 16 and 20 days, depending on how quickly the Coalition finalized their strike coordinates. He thanked me, calmly, as if I had just given him a weather report instead of news that could determine the survival of his entire species. Then he asked one more question, one that stayed with me long after the transmission ended. He asked why I had chosen to risk everything to deliver this warning, when staying silent would have kept me safe within my own empire. I told him the same thing I had told Resen days earlier. I told him that years ago, a human crew found me dying in the wreckage of my own ship, and chose to save me, instead of leaving me to die as an enemy. I told him that choice reshaped everything I believed about strength and mercy, and that I could not, in good conscience, allow an entire species capable of that kind of decision to be destroyed without at least giving them a chance to prepare. He did not respond with gratitude, at least not in words. Instead, he simply said that they would begin preparations immediately, and that if I wished to remain safe, I should stay away from any location the Coalition fleets might target during the opening phase of their assault. I told him I had no intention of hiding. I told him I intended to see this through, whatever that meant for me personally. Over the following days, I received sporadic updates through the same channel, each one revealing more about how humanity was responding to a threat that should have caught them completely unprepared. Colony governors began evacuating non-essential personnel to hardened shelters buried deep beneath planetary crusts. Shipyards that normally operated on standard production schedules shifted into continuous operation, pulling workers from civilian sectors to accelerate the completion of vessels still under construction. Reserve fleets, previously stationed at the edges of human territory for routine patrol duties, were recalled toward the core systems expected to bear the brunt of the Coalition's opening strike. What struck me most, listening to these reports, was the absence of panic. I had expected chaos, confusion, perhaps even disbelief that a warning delivered by an alien defector could be trusted. Instead, every report described calm, methodical action, as if humanity had already wargamed this exact scenario long before I ever sent my transmission. I asked Daniel about this during one of our brief exchanges, curious how a civilization so young could respond to existential threat with such discipline instead of collapsing into disorder. His answer was simple, and it stayed with me. He said that humans had spent most of their history fighting each other before they ever reached the stars, and that history had taught them, painfully and repeatedly, that survival depended on preparation, not hope. He said hoping an attack would not come had never once worked for his species, so they had learned instead to prepare as if every attack was certain, and treat any peace as a temporary gift rather than a guarantee. That philosophy, more than any weapon or tactic, explained everything I had witnessed from a distance over the years. It explained why human colonies, despite being newer and smaller than most established empires, maintained defense infrastructure disproportionate to their size. It explained why their military doctrine emphasized adaptability over rigid strategy, since rigid strategies only worked against enemies who behaved predictably, and humans had learned the galaxy rarely offered predictable enemies. As the days passed, I moved my transport further from populated systems, aware that Council security forces were almost certainly searching for me by now. Resen had warned me before I left that my absence from the Council station would eventually be noticed, and once it was, my transmission logs would be the first thing investigators searched for an explanation. I was right to worry. On the 9th day after my initial warning reached Daniel, I intercepted a coded alert broadcast across Cathari military channels, identifying me by name as a fugitive suspected of leaking classified coalition strategy to hostile forces. The charge did not surprise me. What surprised me was the reward offered for information leading to my capture, a sum large enough to suggest the Council considered my actions a serious threat to the entire operation, not simply an embarrassing act of defiance. I contacted Daniel immediately, informing him of the bounty now placed on my life, and asking whether he believed my continued involvement in this situation might complicate their preparations rather than help them. His response arrived faster than any previous message. He told me that humanity did not abandon those who risked everything to help them, and that arrangements were already being made to bring me to a secure location within human territory before coalition forces could locate my transport. I asked him why they would extend that kind of protection to someone who, by every standard the galaxy operated under, was now considered a traitor and a liability. His answer echoed something Grace had told me decades earlier, back when I was a wounded prisoner, expecting execution instead of medical care. He said that where he came from, you did not calculate the value of helping someone based on what it cost you. You helped because it was the right thing to do, and you dealt with the consequences afterward. 3 days later, a small unmarked vessel intercepted my transport at the edge of a debris field near an abandoned relay station, exactly where Daniel's coordinates had instructed me to wait. The ship that arrived was sleek, fast, clearly built for stealth rather than combat, and it carried no visible markings that would identify it as belonging to any official human fleet. The pilot who greeted me when I boarded introduced herself as Megan Whitfield, a young officer who spoke with the same calm efficiency I had come to associate with every human I had encountered so far. She did not ask why I had betrayed my own empire. She did not treat me with suspicion or hesitation. She simply confirmed my identity, secured my transport in her cargo hold, and set course immediately for a destination she did not disclose until we were well underway. During the journey, I asked her directly how her people could trust an alien defector so completely, especially one whose warning, if false, could have led them into a catastrophic trap. She told me that trust was never unconditional, and that intelligence teams had spent the past several days cross-referencing my warning against independent sensor data gathered from long-range monitoring stations near contested border regions. My information, she said, matched troop movements they had already detected, but could not fully explain until my warning provided the missing context. That answer reassured me more than any expression of gratitude could have. It meant humanity had not simply taken my word at face value out of naive trust. They had verified everything, methodically, the same way they approached every threat, and only after confirming my warning aligned with observable reality did they choose to act on it. We arrived at a fortified installation buried deep within an asteroid field several days later, a facility Megan referred to only as a forward coordination point, one of several such locations established specifically to manage the coalition threat without exposing the location of humanity's primary command centers. Inside, I met Daniel Ashworth in person for the first time, along with a handful of senior officers coordinating the defense effort across multiple colony systems simultaneously. Daniel greeted me with the same measured calm I had heard in his voice during our earlier transmissions. He thanked me formally, in front of his officers, for the warning I had provided, and then asked if I would be willing to assist further, offering whatever knowledge I possessed regarding coalition fleet composition, command structure, and likely strategic priorities. I agreed without hesitation. I had already crossed the point of no return the moment I refused to raise my hand in that council chamber, and there was no version of my future left that did not involve standing fully alongside the species I had chosen to warn. Over the following days, I worked closely with Daniel's staff, providing detailed information about the empires involved in the coalition, their historical rivalries, the tensions simmering beneath their forced cooperation, and the weaknesses in coordination that had plagued similar multi-empire operations in the past. I explained that many of the participating empires had fought wars against each other within living memory, and that their alliance against humanity was born entirely from shared fear rather than genuine trust or friendship. Daniel listened carefully to every detail, occasionally asking precise follow-up questions that revealed how quickly he was already reshaping strategy around the information I provided. He did not treat me as a curiosity or as a defector to be watched with suspicion. He treated me as what I had chosen to become, an ally with valuable knowledge, deserving of the same respect any human officer would receive under similar circumstances. It was during one of these strategy sessions that Grace Coleman finally arrived at the installation, having been recalled from a separate assignment once word spread that I was the one who delivered the original warning. Seeing her again after so many years, standing in a fortified command center rather than the medical bay where she had once treated my wounds, brought back a wave of memory I had not fully prepared myself for. She approached me directly, studying my face for a long moment before speaking. She told me she never expected our paths to cross again, especially not under circumstances like these, where the fate of her entire species rested partly on information I had risked everything to deliver. I told her that meeting her all those years ago had changed the course of my life more completely than she could have known, and that everything I had done since, including the choice that made me a fugitive from my own empire, traced back to the simple decision she made to save a dying enemy instead of leaving him to die in the wreckage of his ship. She did not respond with pride, or satisfaction, or any sense of having done something extraordinary. She simply said that helping someone in need had never felt like a decision worth taking credit for. It had simply felt like the only choice that made sense. As preparations for the coming assault intensified around us, I understood, more clearly than ever, why the Coalition feared humanity so deeply. It was not simply their weapons, or their tactics, or their unpredictable resilience in battle. It was this, a quiet, unshakable commitment to doing what was right, even when no one was watching, even when it offered no immediate advantage, even when the cost of that commitment might one day include their own survival. The Coalition believed they were preparing to erase a dangerous variable from the galaxy. What they did not yet understand was that the variable they feared was not built from cruelty or ambition. It was built from something far more difficult to fight, and far more difficult to destroy. 22 days after the Council vote, the Coalition fleets dropped out of transit space at the edges of 6 major human systems simultaneously, exactly as intelligence reports had predicted, though the sheer scale of what arrived still left me speechless when I saw the sensor readings scroll across the command display in front of me. Over 1,000 warships, drawn from the combined forces of a dozen empires, spread across the outer approach corridors of human territory like a slow-moving storm front. I had spent my entire life studying military doctrine across multiple civilizations, and even I had never witnessed a coordinated deployment of this magnitude. Every empire that voted in favor of the attack had sent ships, some contributing only a handful of vessels as a symbolic gesture of unity, others committing entire battle fleets they could barely afford to spare. I stood beside Daniel Ashworth in the Forward Command Center, watching the tactical display update in real time as the Coalition ships advanced. Around us, human officers moved with a focused efficiency that reminded me of Grace treating my wounds all those years ago, calm hands performing difficult work without wasted motion or panic. I asked Daniel how his defense fleets, numbering barely a fraction of what the Coalition had assembled, intended to survive an assault of this scale. He told me, without a trace of false confidence, that survival was never guaranteed, and that his people had never once assumed otherwise. What mattered was making the cost of victory so unbearable that the Coalition would question whether continuing the assault was worth what it would take from them. The first wave of Coalition ships pushed into the outer defense perimeter of a colony system called Halden's Reach, a mid-sized human settlement chosen, according to intercepted Coalition communications, specifically because its modest population made it seem like an easy target to demoralize the rest of humanity before the larger assaults began. What the Coalition commanders did not know, and what I only learned myself in the hours before the attack began, was that Halden's Reach had spent the past 3 weeks transforming from a peaceful colony into one of the most heavily fortified systems in human territory. Civilian population centers had been evacuated to shielded underground shelters. Automated defense platforms, hastily constructed from repurposed mining equipment and salvaged warship components, had been positioned throughout the system's asteroid belts, disguised as harmless debris. When the Coalition's lead battle group entered firing range, expecting minimal resistance from what their intelligence assessments described as a lightly defended colony, the ambush that followed reshaped everything I thought I understood about human warfare. Disguised defense platforms activated in perfect coordination, catching the Coalition's forward ships in a crossfire from positions their sensors had completely failed to detect. Simultaneously, A squadron of human warships that intelligence reports had placed at a completely different system emerged from a concealed position behind one of Halden's Reach's outer moons, striking the Coalition fleet's flank before their formation could adjust. I watched the tactical display with something close to disbelief, as Coalition ships, vastly outnumbering the defenders on paper, found themselves caught in an engagement they had not prepared for. Human vessels moved with a coordination that seemed almost impossible, given their smaller numbers, each ship compensating for another's position without hesitation, adapting their formation continuously as the battle unfolded. Daniel explained, as we watched the engagement progress, that human military doctrine had shifted decades earlier toward decentralized command structures, training every officer to make independent tactical decisions rather than waiting for orders from a central authority. This meant that even when communication between ships became difficult during the chaos of battle, human fleets continued functioning as a coordinated whole, each vessel understanding the broader strategy well enough to adapt without constant guidance. The Coalition, by contrast, struggled with a problem I recognized immediately from years of studying inter-empire cooperation. Ships from different empires operated under different command protocols, different communication standards, and different strategic doctrines, forcing Coalition commanders to spend precious time translating orders and resolving conflicting tactical philosophies even as the battle raged around them. I watched a Coalition destroyer from the Dravith fleet hesitate at a critical moment, waiting for confirmation from an Allied command ship before adjusting its position, only for that hesitation to leave it exposed to a coordinated strike from two human vessels that had already anticipated the gap in Coalition coverage. Within the first hour of engagement, the Coalition's lead battle group had suffered losses far exceeding anything their intelligence assessments had predicted. Ships that should have overwhelmed the defenders through sheer numbers found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to behave according to any established pattern of engagement. But what struck me most, watching from the relative safety of the command center, was not simply the tactical brilliance of the human defense. It was the composure of the human crews themselves, visible even through the fragmented communication feeds relayed back to our position. I listened to recorded transmissions between human pilots during the height of the engagement, and I heard none of the panic I expected from crews facing an enemy that outnumbered them many times over. Instead, I heard calm, precise communication, pilots calling out enemy positions, and coordinating strikes with the same measured tone Daniel used during our earlier strategy sessions. Even as ships around them were damaged or destroyed, the surviving crews continued executing their assigned roles without breaking formation or abandoning their positions. A young pilot named Oliver Bennett, whose voice I would come to recognize across multiple engagements in the days that followed, calmly reported taking heavy damage to his ship's forward shields while simultaneously providing cover for a damaged Allied vessel attempting to withdraw from the engagement. There was no fear in his voice, only focus, as if the danger to his own life was simply a variable to be managed rather than a reason to abandon his responsibility to protect others. I asked Daniel how human crews maintained this level of composure under such extreme pressure, especially against odds that should have overwhelmed any reasonable expectation of survival. He told me that human military training placed enormous emphasis on trust, not simply trust in command structures, but trust between individual crew members, built through extensive training exercises designed to simulate exactly this kind of overwhelming pressure long before crews ever faced it in real combat. He said that fear became manageable when a person trusted absolutely that the person beside them would do everything possible to keep them alive, and that this trust, cultivated deliberately over years of training, became more valuable in battle than any weapon or ship design. As the engagement at Halden's Reach continued into its second hour, Coalition commanders made a decision that revealed the deeper cracks forming within their alliance. Faced with unexpectedly heavy losses, the commander of the Dravith battle group ordered a partial withdrawal, pulling his ships back from the engagement without coordinating the decision with Allied forces still actively fighting. This unilateral withdrawal exposed the flank of an Orangi battle group that had been relying on Dravith ships to cover their approach vector, forcing Orangi commanders to make a desperate adjustment mid-battle that further disrupted the coalition's already fragile coordination. I watched this unfold with a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow, remembering my own warnings to the Council about the fragility of forced cooperation between empires who had spent centuries treating each other as rivals rather than allies. Fear had brought these empires together long enough to approve an attack, but fear alone could not sustain the kind of trust necessary to fight a coordinated battle against an enemy who refused to fight predictably. By the time the engagement at Halden's Reach concluded, coalition forces had withdrawn entirely from the system, having lost nearly a third of their initial battle group, while inflicting only moderate damage on the human defense forces. It was not a decisive victory in the sense of eliminating the coalition threat entirely, but it was a devastating blow to the confidence that had carried the coalition into this assault in the first place. Daniel received the battle reports with the same measured calm he had shown throughout the engagement, though I noticed a brief moment where he closed his eyes and exhaled slowly before continuing his review of the data. When I asked if the outcome matched his expectations, he told me that every victory in war came with a cost, and that even a successful defense meant human lives lost, families receiving news no family should ever have to receive. That response surprised me more than the battle itself. I had expected celebration, or at least relief, given how thoroughly the coalition's assault had been repelled. Instead, I witnessed something closer to quiet grief, carefully managed but unmistakably present, as Daniel reviewed the names of human crew members who had not survived the engagement. I asked him how he could continue functioning, continue making the difficult decisions required to coordinate an ongoing defense across multiple systems, while carrying that weight so visibly. He told me that grief and duty were not opposites, and that allowing himself to feel the cost of every decision was what kept him from becoming the kind of commander who treated lives as expendable statistics. He said that the day he stopped feeling the weight of losses like these would be the day he was no longer fit to command anyone. As reports continued arriving from the other systems targeted in the coalition's opening assault, a pattern began to emerge that echoed what had happened at Halden's Reach. In every engagement, coalition forces significantly outnumbered their human defenders, yet in every engagement, that numerical advantage failed to translate into the swift, decisive victory their intelligence assessments had promised. At a system called New Ashford, a coalition battle group attempting a rapid strike against orbital shipyards found their approach vector predicted almost perfectly by defense forces who had clearly studied coalition tactical doctrine extensively before the engagement began. At a smaller colony designated only by a numerical identifier, a token coalition force sent to seize the system with minimal resistance instead found themselves facing defense fortifications far more extensive than any pre-battle assessment had indicated. I began to understand, watching these reports accumulate throughout the following days, that humanity had spent the weeks following my warning not simply preparing defenses, but studying their enemy with the same rigorous discipline they applied to every other aspect of their survival. Every scrap of intelligence I had provided about coalition fleet composition, command structure, and inter-empire tension had been analyzed, verified, and incorporated into a defense strategy built specifically to exploit the very weaknesses I had described. Daniel confirmed this when I raised the observation during one of our late briefings. He told me that information without preparation was worthless, and that the value of my warning had never been simply the time it bought them, but the specific knowledge it provided about exactly how the coalition intended to fight, and exactly where the seams in their alliance were most likely to tear under pressure. As the first phase of the coalition's assault drew to a close, with losses far exceeding anything the Council had anticipated when they approved this attack, I found myself reflecting on the strange position I now occupied. I had betrayed my own empire to warn a species I barely understood, based on nothing more than a single act of mercy shown to me decades earlier, and now, watching humanity not simply survive but actively dismantle the confidence of an alliance built from a dozen empires, I understood that mercy had never been a weakness in these people. It had always been a choice, made deliberately, by a species that understood exactly what it meant to fight for survival without losing sight of who they wanted to remain once the fighting ended. The coalition had expected an easy campaign against an inexperienced enemy. What they were beginning to discover, one costly engagement at a time, was that they had underestimated something far more dangerous than raw military strength. They had underestimated a species that fought with everything they had, precisely because they refused to become the kind of people who fought any other way. By the 10th day of sustained conflict, the true shape of what the Council had unleashed became impossible to ignore, even for the empires who had voted so confidently in favor of annihilation. What began as a coordinated strike meant to crush humanity before it could grow into a lasting threat had instead become something the coalition had no framework to manage. A prolonged campaign against an enemy that adapted faster than any strategy could account for. I spent those days working alongside Daniel's staff, reviewing intelligence gathered from every engagement, and what I found consistently unsettled me more than the battles themselves. Human forces were not simply defending their territory, they were learning, at a pace that defied every model of technological adaptation I had studied throughout my career. During an engagement near a mining colony called Ferris Hollow, coalition forces deployed a new type of shielding technology recently developed by the Voss Empire, designed specifically to counter the kinetic weapons systems humanity had relied on in earlier engagements. Reports from the battle indicated that within the first 30 minutes of contact, human ships had already begun adjusting their weapon frequencies to compensate, achieving partial penetration of the new shields by the end of the engagement. I asked Daniel how his crews managed to analyze and counter an entirely unfamiliar defensive technology in the middle of active combat, a task that would have taken most engineering teams weeks of careful study under controlled conditions. He explained that human warships carried onboard analysis systems specifically designed to process combat data in real time, feeding adjustments directly to weapon control systems during active engagements. He said this capability had been developed over generations of conflict on their homeworld, long before humanity ever reached the stars, born from a history of constantly evolving warfare that punished any force too slow to adapt. What troubled the coalition far more than this adaptability, based on intercepted communications I helped translate during this period, was humanity's willingness to sustain losses that would have broken the morale of most other military forces. In several engagements, human fleets continued pressing offensive maneuvers even after suffering damage that, by any conventional military calculation, should have prompted an immediate withdrawal. I listened to one particularly striking transmission, recovered from a damaged coalition vessel, recorded during an engagement near a system called Corin's Gate. A coalition tactical officer, speaking to his commanding admiral, expressed something close to disbelief as he described watching a squadron of human ships continue advancing despite having lost nearly half their formation to sustained fire. He said the human pilots did not hesitate, did not break formation, and did not attempt to disengage even as their casualties mounted, continuing their assault with a discipline that unsettled every coalition officer monitoring the engagement. Daniel, when I shared this observation with him, offered an explanation that reframed everything I thought I understood about human resolve. He told me that human military doctrine did not measure success purely by ship counts or casualty numbers, but by mission completion, and that pilots were trained to understand the broader strategic purpose behind every engagement, not simply the tactical details of the battle in front of them. He explained that at Corin's Gate, the squadron in question had been tasked with disrupting a coalition supply convoy critical to sustaining the broader offensive, and that every pilot involved understood that failing to complete that mission, regardless of personal cost, would extend the suffering of countless human colonies still bracing for potential attack. Their willingness to continue advancing despite heavy losses was not recklessness. It was a calculated acceptance that some sacrifices, made deliberately and with full understanding of the stakes, served a purpose larger than individual survival. I found myself struggling to reconcile this explanation with everything I had witnessed of human compassion during my time among them. How could a species so committed to individual mercy also demonstrate such willingness to accept devastating losses in pursuit of a larger objective. It was during a conversation with Grace, several days into this period of escalating conflict, that I finally began to understand the connection between these two seemingly contradictory qualities. Grace explained that human history was filled with examples of ordinary people choosing extraordinary sacrifice, not because they lacked value for their own lives, but because they understood that some choices mattered more than personal survival. She said that the same capacity for empathy that led humans to show mercy toward defeated enemies also led them to accept terrible costs when protecting those they were responsible for, because both choices came from the same underlying value, a refusal to measure worth purely in terms of self-interest. As the days progressed, coalition forces began adopting increasingly aggressive tactics in an attempt to break through humanity's adaptive defenses, and it was during this period that the true fractures within the coalition alliance became impossible to hide. Empires that had entered this conflict with confident assurances of quick victory now found themselves questioning whether continued participation was worth the losses their fleets had already suffered. Intercepted communications revealed growing tension between the Draveth and Orengi command structures, each blaming the other for tactical failures during the opening engagements. The Voss Empire, whose new shielding technology had been so quickly countered, began quietly reducing their fleet contributions to subsequent engagements, citing the need to preserve resources for what they described as ongoing research and development priorities, a diplomatic phrase that everyone understood as a polite withdrawal from active combat. I remember a specific engagement during the 12th day of conflict that revealed just how deeply this coalition fracture had progressed. A joint strike force, composed of Draveth and Orengi vessels, attempted a coordinated assault against a defended human shipyard, only for their attack to unravel almost immediately due to conflicting tactical assumptions between the two fleets. The Draveth commander, expecting the Orengi forces to provide covering fire during the initial approach, advanced his ships ahead of schedule, only to find the Orengi fleet still completing pre-engagement checks according to their own standard procedures. This miscommunication left the Draveth forward elements exposed for nearly 4 critical minutes, a window human defense forces exploited with devastating precision, concentrating fire on the isolated vessels before the Orengi fleet could arrive to provide support. By the time the engagement ended, the Joint Strike Force had suffered losses so severe that both empires publicly blamed the other for the failure, further deepening the mistrust that had been simmering beneath the coalition's forced cooperation since the very beginning. Daniel, reviewing these reports with his staff, made an observation that stayed with me long after that briefing concluded. He said that humanity's greatest advantage in this conflict was not any single weapon, tactic, or piece of technology. It was the simple fact that every human ship in this fight trusted every other human ship completely, a trust built through generations of shared purpose, while the coalition arrayed against them was fighting to hold together an alliance built on nothing more than temporary fear. That observation proved increasingly accurate as the conflict progressed into its 3rd week. Coalition commanders, facing mounting losses and eroding cooperation between their forces, began shifting strategy away from coordinated large-scale assaults toward smaller, more isolated strikes against individual human colonies, an approach that inadvertently played directly into humanity's greatest strength. Human defense forces, no longer facing overwhelming coordinated assaults, were able to concentrate their adaptive tactical advantages against smaller coalition strike groups, achieving victories that further eroded the confidence of empires already questioning whether this campaign was worth continuing. Reports began reaching us of coalition vessels retreating from engagements before contact was even fully established, commanders unwilling to risk further losses against an enemy whose tactical unpredictability had already cost them so dearly. I found myself, during this period, increasingly drawn into conversations with human officers beyond Daniel and Grace, learning more about the culture that had produced such a formidable and paradoxical species. I spoke with a logistics coordinator named Claire Whitmore, who explained how human civilian populations, far from panicking under the threat of invasion, had organized themselves into support networks, providing supplies, medical assistance, and manufacturing capacity to sustain the ongoing defense effort. I spoke with a young engineer named Nathan Price, who described working continuous shifts alongside colleagues he had known for years, driven not by orders from above, but by a shared understanding that their work directly determined whether their colony would survive the coming weeks. Every conversation reinforced the same underlying truth I had first glimpsed decades earlier, drifting wounded in the wreckage of my own ship. Humanity's strength was not simply military capability, though that capability had proven far more formidable than any coalition assessment predicted. Their true strength was a collective commitment to each other, expressed through countless individual choices made by ordinary people who understood, without needing to be told, exactly what was at stake, and exactly what their contribution meant to the larger effort. As the third week of conflict drew toward its conclusion, coalition losses had grown severe enough that even the most committed empires within the alliance began quietly exploring diplomatic alternatives to continued combat. I learned of this shift through intercepted communications between coalition command staff, discussions that had begun to include cautious references to negotiated settlements rather than continued military escalation. Daniel, upon reviewing this intelligence, called a meeting with his senior staff to discuss how humanity should respond to what appeared to be a weakening resolve among coalition leadership. I attended this meeting as well, curious how a species capable of such fierce resistance would approach the possibility of ending this conflict before achieving what many coalition commanders had assumed would be humanity's inevitable collapse. What I heard during that meeting surprised me more than any battle report from the preceding weeks. Rather than advocating for continued offensive action to punish the empires who had approved this attack, several officers argued for extending diplomatic overtures immediately, seeking to end the conflict with as little further loss of life as possible, on both sides of the engagement. Daniel listened carefully to every perspective before offering his own assessment, one that revealed something fundamental about how humanity understood the purpose of their resistance. He said that the goal of this defense had never been vengeance against the empires who attacked them. The goal had always been survival, and the moment survival could be secured through negotiation rather than continued conflict, pursuing peace became the only responsible course of action, regardless of how justified anger toward the coalition might feel. That statement, more than anything I had witnessed on the battlefield, revealed to me the true nature of what the coalition had feared without ever truly understanding. Humanity was not a nightmare because they fought without mercy. They were a nightmare to those who had underestimated them because they fought with everything they had while never losing sight of the values that made their survival worth fighting for in the first place. News of my role in warning humanity reached my homeworld faster than I expected, carried through coalition intelligence channels that had finally pieced together the full picture of how their assault had failed to achieve the swift victory everyone anticipated. Within weeks, the Cathari remnant found itself the target of accusations from nearly every empire involved in the failed campaign, all of them convinced that my warning had been sanctioned at the highest levels of my own government, rather than the desperate, unauthorized act of a single defector. I learned of this development through a private message from Resin, the young officer who had walked with me through that corridor the night the council first approved the attack. His message carried none of the confusion or fear I remembered from our earlier conversation. Instead, it carried something closer to quiet determination, as if the weeks since my departure had forced him to confront questions about loyalty and conscience that he had never previously allowed himself to consider. He told me that Cathari leadership was under intense pressure from coalition partners, facing threats of economic isolation and military retaliation, unless they could prove my actions had been the work of a rogue individual rather than official policy. He said the council had already stripped me of my rank and citizenship, formally declaring me an enemy of the remnant, but that this gesture alone had not satisfied the empires demanding accountability for what they viewed as a catastrophic betrayal. I asked him what more the coalition expected from a government that had already disowned me publicly and offered a substantial reward for my capture. His answer revealed the deeper danger my actions had created for my own people. He told me that several coalition members were now demanding the Cathari remnant contribute additional military resources to the ongoing campaign against humanity, as a demonstration of loyalty meant to erase any lingering suspicion that my warning had been more than a single act of individual defiance. Our already depleted fleet, barely sufficient to maintain order within our remaining territories, was being pressured into a conflict none of our leadership believed we could survive participating in. This news struck me harder than any battle report I had reviewed during my time with Daniel's staff. I had accepted, from the moment I refused to raise my hand in that council chamber, that my own future within Cathari society was likely over. What I had not fully anticipated was that my choice might endanger the very people I had hoped to protect through my continued presence within that government, people like Resan, who now found themselves caught between loyalty to a homeland under threat and growing doubts about whether that homeland's continued cooperation with the coalition served any purpose beyond delaying an inevitable confrontation neither side wanted. I brought this information to Daniel immediately, explaining the pressure now being placed on my former government and the very real possibility that Cathari forces might soon be compelled to join the coalition assault directly, adding additional strain to a conflict that had already proven far more costly than anyone anticipated. Daniel listened carefully, and I noticed something shift in his expression as I finished explaining the situation, a recognition that this development carried implications extending beyond simple military strategy. He asked me directly whether I believed Cathari leadership genuinely wanted to participate in this conflict, or whether their potential involvement was purely a response to coercion from more powerful coalition members. I told him honestly that I believed the Cathari remnant had no genuine interest in this war whatsoever. My people had spent decades rebuilding from previous conflicts that had nearly destroyed us entirely, and the idea of committing our remaining resources to a war against a species we had no historical grievance against seemed, to anyone with a clear view of our situation, an act of self-destruction disguised as loyalty. Daniel considered this for a long moment before responding. He told me that humanity had no interest in fighting an enemy who did not wish to fight them, and that if there was any possibility of preventing Cathari involvement in this conflict, he wanted to explore it fully before any further escalation made such a conversation impossible. This conversation marked a turning point in how I understood my own role within this unfolding crisis. I had begun this journey believing my only contribution would be a warning, a single act of conscience, that might buy humanity time to prepare for an assault they could not otherwise anticipate. Now I found myself positioned as something closer to an intermediary, someone with unique insight into both the coalition's internal weaknesses and the specific pressures being placed on smaller empires like my own, pressures that might, if properly understood, offer humanity a path toward fracturing the coalition from within, rather than simply outlasting their military assault through continued combat. I proposed an idea to Daniel that had been forming in my thoughts since learning of the pressure placed on my former government. I suggested that humanity attempt direct communication with Cathari leadership, not through official coalition channels, but through a private approach similar to the one I had used to deliver my original warning, offering assurances that humanity held no hostility toward the Cathari remnant and had no interest in expanding this conflict beyond the empires who had voluntarily chosen to participate in the initial assault. Daniel found merit in this proposal, though he cautioned that any communication of this nature carried significant risk, both for the officers involved in delivering such a message and for the broader diplomatic situation, should other coalition members discover humanity was attempting to negotiate separately with individual empires rather than addressing the coalition as a unified body. Despite these risks, Daniel authorized a small diplomatic mission, led personally by Grace Coleman, whose earlier act of mercy toward me had, in many ways, set this entire chain of events into motion. I found a strange symmetry in this decision, that the same woman who once saved my life through an unremarkable act of compassion would now attempt to extend that same compassion toward the government that had disowned me, in hopes of preventing further unnecessary conflict. Grace's mission required traveling to a neutral relay station near the border of Cathari territory, arranged through careful diplomatic coordination that avoided drawing attention from coalition intelligence networks, still actively monitoring communications throughout the region. I accompanied her on this journey, understanding that my presence, despite the risk of capture, would likely be necessary to establish credibility with whatever Kthari officials agreed to meet with us. The meeting took place 3 days later in a cramped diplomatic chamber aboard the neutral station, where Resin himself arrived as the representative of Kthari leadership, having volunteered for this dangerous assignment despite the personal risk it carried, given his known association with me. Seeing Resin again, after weeks of separation defined by uncertainty and fear for what my choices might have cost him, filled me with an emotion I struggled to fully articulate. He looked older than I remembered, the weight of recent events visible in the way he carried himself, though his eyes still held the same quiet determination I had witnessed during our final conversation before my departure. Grace opened the discussion with a directness that immediately set the tone for everything that followed. She told Resin that humanity held no desire to see the Kthari remnant drawn further into this conflict, and that she had traveled here specifically to offer whatever assurances necessary to help Kthari leadership resist coalition pressure demanding their military participation. Resin listened carefully before responding, explaining the precarious position his government now occupied. He said that Kthari leadership genuinely wished to avoid this conflict, but that resisting coalition demands carried its own severe risks, including the possibility of economic sanctions or even direct military retaliation from coalition members who viewed continued Kthari neutrality as evidence of secret sympathy toward humanity. Grace responded with an offer that surprised even me, despite my growing understanding of how humanity approached these kinds of difficult situations. She proposed that humanity provide the Kthari remnant with quiet economic and material support, delivered through channels designed to avoid detection by coalition intelligence, sufficient to offset whatever losses might result from resisting coalition pressure to join the ongoing military campaign. Resin asked why humanity would extend this kind of support to an empire that had, until recently, been an active participant in a coalition assembled specifically to destroy them. Grace's answer echoed the same philosophy I had encountered from every human I had worked alongside during the preceding weeks. She told him that humanity did not measure the value of helping someone based on past grievances, and that offering support to the Kthari remnant now, when they needed it most, mattered more to humanity's understanding of themselves than any lingering resentment over the Council's original vote to approve the attack. This offer, delivered with such genuine sincerity, seemed to shift something in how Resin understood the situation. He told us that he would carry this proposal back to Kthari leadership, though he could not guarantee how they would respond given the immense pressure already being applied by more powerful coalition members. Before concluding our meeting, Resin turned to me directly, asking a question that had clearly been weighing on him since our arrival. He asked whether I regretted the choice that had led to my exile from our people, given everything that choice had subsequently cost both myself and, indirectly, the broader Kthari population now caught between coalition pressure and their own reluctance to participate in an unnecessary war. I told him, without hesitation, that I did not regret my choice, and that watching humanity respond to this crisis with the same compassion that had first drawn me toward understanding them, even extending that compassion toward the very government that had disowned me, only confirmed everything I had believed when I first refused to raise my hand in that council chamber. 3 weeks after that meeting, word reached us that Kthari leadership had formally declined coalition demands for military participation, citing internal resource constraints as their official justification, while quietly accepting the support humanity had offered through carefully concealed channels. This decision, small in the broader scope of the ongoing conflict, represented the first genuine crack in coalition unity, brought about not through military victory, but through humanity's willingness to extend the same mercy that had defined every interaction I witnessed since the day Grace Coleman first found me drifting, wounded and alone, in the wreckage of a ship that should have been my grave. The Kthari withdrawal from coalition demands sent a ripple through the remaining alliance that Daniel and his officers recognized immediately as an opportunity too significant to ignore. Within days of learning that one empire had successfully resisted coalition pressure without facing immediate retaliation, human intelligence teams began identifying other coalition members whose commitment to the ongoing campaign appeared similarly fragile, weakened by mounting losses and growing doubts about whether continued participation served any purpose beyond honoring a vote made in fear rather than careful strategic judgment. I found myself, during this period, increasingly involved in planning discussions that extended far beyond simple military strategy, drawing on my knowledge of inter-empire politics to help identify which coalition members might be receptive to a negotiated withdrawal from the conflict. Daniel valued this insight enormously, recognizing that ending this war through fracturing coalition unity would ultimately cost fewer lives on both sides than continuing to pursue victory purely through military engagement. It was during one of these planning sessions that Daniel received word of a coalition fleet, composed primarily of Orengi vessels, positioning itself for what appeared to be a final, desperate assault against a heavily populated human colony called Ashgrove Station. Unlike previous coalition strikes, which had targeted smaller or more isolated settlements, this fleet's chosen target suggested a strategy born from frustration rather than careful planning, an attempt to inflict maximum damage and force humanity into a negotiated surrender before coalition unity collapsed entirely. The scale of this assault force exceeded anything humanity had faced during earlier engagements, drawing together nearly every remaining Orengi warship still committed to the coalition cause, reinforced by a smaller contingent of Dravith vessels whose commanders apparently believed a decisive victory here might salvage the coalition's rapidly deteriorating credibility. Daniel convened his full command staff to discuss how humanity should respond to this concentrated threat, and I watched as officers debated strategies ranging from a full defensive stand at Ashgrove Station itself to a more aggressive approach involving intercepting the coalition fleet before it reached the colony's defense perimeter. What emerged from this discussion revealed something about human military philosophy that I had not fully appreciated until this moment. Rather than simply meeting force with force, Daniel's staff developed a strategy designed specifically to corner the approaching coalition fleet, using knowledge of the surrounding system's gravitational features and previously established defense positions to trap the attacking force in a position where continued engagement would result in catastrophic losses for the coalition, while offering them a clear path toward surrender rather than annihilation. I asked Daniel directly why humanity would extend the option of surrender to a fleet that had traveled specifically to destroy an entire human colony, rather than simply pursuing the complete destruction of forces that clearly intended no mercy toward the people they targeted. His answer revealed something fundamental about how humanity understood the purpose of this entire conflict, something I had begun to suspect but had not yet heard articulated so clearly. He told me that the goal had never been to prove humanity could match the coalition's capacity for destruction. The goal was to end this war in a way that demonstrated humanity's strength did not require abandoning the values that made their civilization worth defending in the first place. The battle at Ashgrove Station unfolded over the following 3 days, and it became, in many ways, the defining engagement of the entire conflict. Human forces executed their strategy with a precision that reflected everything I had witnessed during previous engagements, gradually maneuvering the coalition fleet into a position where retreat became increasingly difficult without sustaining severe losses, while simultaneously avoiding any offensive action that might force the trapped fleet into a desperate final stand. I watched from the command center as human vessels methodically closed off escape routes, their movements coordinated with a patience that surprised even the coalition commanders monitoring the engagement, based on intercepted communications I helped translate throughout the unfolding battle. Rather than pressing an aggressive assault, the moment the coalition fleet's position became vulnerable, human forces maintained a defensive posture, allowing the trapped commanders time to fully recognize the hopelessness of their situation before any further escalation occurred. On the third day, with coalition supply lines effectively severed and no viable path toward either victory or safe withdrawal remaining, the commander of the Orengi fleet opened a direct communication channel with Daniel, requesting terms for surrender rather than continuing an engagement that promised only further losses without any realistic hope of achieving their original objective. I sat beside Daniel as he received this transmission, watching his expression carefully for any sign of the satisfaction or vindication I might have expected given everything humanity had endured throughout this conflict. Instead, I saw only the same measured calm that had defined every interaction I witnessed from him since our first exchange weeks earlier. Daniel's response to the surrender request revealed the full depth of humanity's approach to this war. He did not demand punitive reparations designed to cripple the Orengi Empire for generations. He did not require the surrender of their entire fleet as spoils of victory, a standard practice among most empires I had studied throughout my career. Instead, he offered terms that allowed the trapped fleet to withdraw from human territory entirely, provided they agreed to formally end their participation in the coalition and commit to a binding non-aggression agreement with humanity moving forward. The Orengi commander, according to the transmission logs I later reviewed, expressed clear disbelief at the leniency of these terms, asking directly why humanity would forego the opportunity to permanently weaken an empire that had traveled across known space with the explicit intention of destroying an entire human colony. Daniel's response to this question, delivered with the same calm sincerity I had come to recognize as fundamentally human, stayed with me long after that engagement concluded. He told the Orengi commander that humanity's strength had never been measured by their capacity to destroy an enemy who could no longer fight back, and that offering mercy now, at the height of their advantage, mattered more to humanity's understanding of themselves than any strategic benefit gained from crushing a defeated foe. The Orengi fleet accepted these terms within hours, formally withdrawing their forces from human territory and severing their participation in the coalition, a decision that reverberated throughout the remaining alliance far more powerfully than any military defeat could have achieved. Within days, reports began reaching us of similar negotiations occurring independently across multiple coalition fronts, as other empires, watching the Orengi withdrawal unfold, began quietly exploring their own paths toward ending participation in a war that had already cost them far more than anyone anticipated when the Council first cast its vote. I found myself reflecting, during this period of rapid diplomatic unraveling, on everything I had witnessed since that initial Council session where I stood alone in refusing to approve the coalition's attack. I had believed, at that time, that humanity's mercy represented a form of weakness the other empires would inevitably exploit. What I witnessed instead was mercy functioning as a strategic and moral strength beyond anything the coalition's calculated aggression could match, a demonstration that even total victory did not require the abandonment of compassion, and that offering an enemy the chance to withdraw with dignity often achieved more lasting peace than any punishment designed purely to satisfy a desire for retribution. Grace, when I shared this reflection with her during a quiet moment following the Ashgrove Station engagement, offered a perspective that helped me understand why this approach mattered so deeply to humanity's broader philosophy of conflict. She told me that the empires who had approved this attack were driven by fear, a fear that saw humanity's growing strength as an inevitable threat requiring preemptive destruction. Responding to that fear with equally merciless destruction, she explained, would have confirmed every assumption that drove the coalition toward war in the first place. Responding instead with strength tempered by genuine mercy demonstrated something the coalition had no framework to understand, a species capable of tremendous power that chose, deliberately and repeatedly, not to become defined by that power alone. As the coalition continued fracturing in the weeks following the Ashgrove Station surrender, I understood that the true nightmare the coalition had feared was finally being revealed in its complete form. It was not humanity's capacity for destruction that had shattered their alliance from within. It was humanity's refusal to become the very thing the coalition feared they would become, a refusal that left every empire who had approved this attack confronting an uncomfortable truth about the nature of their own actions, one that no amount of military strength could help them escape. 6 weeks after the surrender at Ashgrove Station, the Galactic Council reconvened in the same chamber where the original vote to attack humanity had passed, with only my single dissent standing against it. This time, the atmosphere within that vast hall bore no resemblance to the confident unity I remembered from months earlier. Delegates who had once spoken with absolute certainty about the necessity of preemptive destruction now sat in careful silence, waiting to hear how the Council would address the collapse of an alliance that had cost so many empires, far more than any of them had anticipated when they first raised their hands in approval. I attended this session not as a fugitive facing arrest, but as an official representative of humanity, invited by Daniel himself to help facilitate the diplomatic proceedings that would determine the future relationship between the coalition empires and the species they had so badly misjudged. My presence in that chamber, seated openly among human delegates rather than hiding in exile, marked a transformation in my circumstances that I could scarcely have imagined during those desperate days aboard a rented transport, waiting to learn whether my warning would even reach its intended destination in time. The Grand Speaker, the same ancient Voss elder who had questioned my dissent months earlier, opened the session by acknowledging what every delegate in that chamber already understood. The coalition's assault against human territory had failed catastrophically, not merely in military terms, but in the far more damaging sense of exposing deep fractures within an alliance that had been held together by nothing more substantial than shared fear. One by one, representatives from the empires who had participated in the original assault rose to address the Council, and I listened as each of them offered some variation of the same difficult admission. The Dravith ambassador acknowledged that his empire's military losses had been far more severe than initial projections suggested, losses that would take generations to fully recover from. The Orengi representative, whose fleet had accepted humanity's surrender terms at Ashgrove Station, spoke candidly about how that experience had fundamentally changed his government's understanding of what conflict with humanity actually meant, not simply in terms of military cost, but in terms of the moral clarity humanity had demonstrated, even at the height of their tactical advantage. When Daniel rose to address the Council, speaking on behalf of humanity for the first time in this formal setting, I watched the entire chamber fall into a silence more complete than anything I had witnessed during my years attending council sessions. He did not speak with anger toward the empires who had approved his species' destruction. He did not demand punitive concessions or extract promises of tribute in exchange for peace. Instead, he offered something that revealed, in its entirety, the philosophy that had guided humanity through every difficult decision I had witnessed since the day I first delivered my warning. He told the assembled delegates that humanity had no interest in becoming a permanent enemy to any empire willing to pursue genuine peace, and that the terms extended to the Orengi fleet at Ashgrove Station represented the standard humanity intended to hold for every coalition member seeking to end their participation in this conflict. He proposed a framework for lasting peace built not on punishment or subjugation, but on mutual non-aggression agreements that would allow every empire involved, including those who had lost the most during this brief but costly war, to rebuild without the burden of ongoing hostility. The Council's response to this proposal revealed just how thoroughly the events of the preceding months had reshaped the galaxy's understanding of humanity. Empire after empire voted in favor of Daniel's framework. The same delegates who had once unanimously approved humanity's destruction now unanimously embracing a peace that asked nothing from them beyond a genuine commitment to leave humanity alone. Before the session concluded, the Grand Speaker turned his attention toward me directly, acknowledging publicly, for the first time, that my dissenting vote months earlier had proven more prescient than the combined judgment of every other delegate in that chamber. He asked if I had any final words to offer the Council before the session formally adjourned. I rose slowly, aware of the weight this moment carried, not simply for myself, but for the Kthari remnant, whose willingness to resist coalition pressure had played its own quiet role in the broader unraveling of this conflict. I told the Council that the mistake made months earlier had never truly been a failure of military judgment. It had been a failure of understanding, a fear-driven assumption that a species capable of tremendous strength must inevitably become defined by that strength alone. Humanity had proven, through every difficult choice made across this conflict, that power and compassion were not opposing forces requiring a choice between them, but qualities that could exist together, reinforcing rather than undermining each other. In the months that followed this historic council session, the Cathari remnant's relationship with humanity deepened considerably, transitioning from the quiet economic support Grace had first offered Resin during our secret meeting into a formal alliance recognized throughout galactic diplomatic circles. My own citizenship, once formally stripped by a government desperate to appease coalition pressure, was fully restored, alongside a new designation granting me joint status as a liaison officer serving both Cathari and human interests. Daniel personally recommended me for command of a newly established joint vessel, crewed by both human and Cathari officers, designed specifically to represent this unprecedented alliance as it began establishing diplomatic and economic ties throughout regions of space previously closed to meaningful cooperation between our two peoples. Risen, whose courage during our tense negotiation months earlier had never fully received the recognition it deserved, joined me as my second in command, a fitting continuation of the friendship that had first formed during our long walk through that council corridor on the night everything began. I think often, even now, about the strange sequence of choices that led to this outcome. A single act of mercy shown to a wounded enemy decades ago, a refusal to raise my hand in agreement with an assembly convinced that fear justified destruction, a warning delivered across the void, uncertain whether it would even reach its destination in time to matter. Each of these choices, small and uncertain in the moment they were made, ultimately reshaped the balance of an entire galaxy, proving that the true nightmare feared by every empire who voted for humanity's destruction was never their capacity for violence. The true nightmare, the one that reshaped everything the galaxy believed about strength and survival, was a species capable of overwhelming power, who chose, again and again, even when no one was watching and nothing required it of them, to remain something better than the fear that had been directed against them. That choice, repeated consistently across every battle, every negotiation, and every difficult decision made throughout this conflict, proved far more formidable than any weapon the coalition had ever assembled against them. And as I look toward the future now, commanding a vessel built from an alliance nobody believed possible months earlier, I understand that the galaxy learned something that day the coalition first arrived at human space, expecting an easy, decisive victory. They learned that the deadliest force among the stars had also proven to be its most merciful, and that combination, more than any single battle or betrayal, was the true beginning of a new understanding, one that would shape the future of every empire brave enough to build something better than the fear that once defined them.